Well, so, back again for another wee ramble. You know, as I drove over here towards Loch Ness, even the sort of things I was passing sort of helped to sort of strengthen the thoughts that I was already having at present. You know, I passed a golf course, or a driving range even. There was just a bunch of dudes. Drove past a woman with a pram. People driving into local supermarkets. Just people living their lives, effectively. And that good old-fashioned expression, ignorance is bliss, sort of sprung to mind yet again. It's like you have these sort of moments where you question whether or not you're kind of going insane. How can people not see what I see? Is it me that's crazy? You know, you do genuinely second guess yourself from time to time. And sort of leads me on to yet another thing that I've found irritating in the last few days. Was a member of the Scottish Liberal Democrats has called on Police Scotland to do more to recruit BAMEs. And this is a white guy. I can't, for the life of me, remember his name off the top of my head. He's the same Liberal Democrat who's pushing through the bill in Parliament in Scotland for assisted suicide. He's also quite often the convener when the Green MSP isn't the convener. Nonetheless, it was him. You know, obviously the way that the article was worded was that there are calls for Police Scotland to do more to diversify their police force. As you start to read through the article, the percentages are broken down of the ethnic makeup of Scotland. And, you know, it was BAMEs make up approximately 4.5%. So, obviously, the census hasn't come out yet, but they're already estimating that it's half a percentage more than it was in 2011. Nonetheless, they then went on to say that about 1% of the police force is BAME. And naturally, what they're trying to insinuate with this, not just this article, nor just this Liberal Democrat, but just in general, because this is a very common theme. The sort of conclusion to take away from this is that because 4% or 4.5% of the overall police force in Scotland is not quote-unquote BAME, that somehow indicates an issue that needs to be rectified. Where do they manage to clutch these straws from, I hear you ask? Well, that comes from proportionate representation, or proportional representation, which effectively suggests, as kind of what I've alluded to there, that if, in this instance, 4.5% of the overall population in any given country is BAME, that means that 4.5% of the police need to be BAME. You know, and it just irritated me, because yet again this is wrong on so many levels. First, being probably the most obvious to me, yet for some peculiar reason is the most uncommonly acknowledged thing amongst what would be considered normies. And that is the fact that, what is the issue with the police force at present in Scotland being quote-unquote whites? What's the issue? Why is that a problem? You know, I mean, it would go without saying that in a predominantly white country, the police force is going to be white. Yeah, I get it. But that ties into the issue of what happens when it's no longer predominantly white. Will you still get away with using that caveat? Or that pushback? No. Not if you follow their logic. Proportionate representation and all. But more to my point, why is it such an issue at present that the police force is white. What can the police not do with a white workforce that they could do differently with a black workforce, or a half white, half brown / black workforce? The issue here is it's because it's white. Even the argument that they tried to hide behind, that it's a lack of representation, should fall flat on its face, because they don't see themselves. They want to see more people that look like them. They don't like looking at whitey. Will white people be able to make the same calls when we're a minority? Whites don't see themselves in a predominantly black country. Like, the argument is always, or should I say, like the likes of Sargon or whomever will always go, well, naturally the police force is going to be predominantly white because it's a white country. But we're talking about proportionate representation. If you start to go down this route, what happens when 10% of the population is BAME? By this logic, 10% of the police force must be BAME. 20% of the population is now BAME. By this logic, 20% of the police force must be BAME. Until you get to a point where 50%, 60% of this institution in particular, not limited to, of course, must be BAME. Where does it end? I think fundamentally the issue here is more on the fact that they have an issue with people being in positions of power because they're white. And it sort of ties me back into what I was saying initially, where, you know, people I drove past today, they're totally oblivious. You know, politics, for me, when I was growing up, was one of those things that you could ignore, for the most part, because yes, the odd policy might come into effect that could have a sort of impact on your life in one shape or form, but as a teenager or a child, it's more your parents it would affect. And, you know, but by and large, irrespective of whether it was Tory or Labour you voted in, nothing really would change. And that's a sort of consensus amongst the vast majority of people. People who, may I add, still go out and vote, despite knowing this fact. But you could, for the most part, kind of just go about your life and ignore these issues because they didn't really affect you. But more and more in these days, we're starting to see it becoming more and more difficult to actually ignore. Because it's starting to affect the real world. It's starting to have effect on people's day-to-day lives. Especially where the climate nonsense is concerned, but not limited to. The LGBT lobbies, in plural. And then you've got all this fucking shit about anti-racism, feminism, of course. That's probably the longest one out of the lot, in all honesty. Feminist narrative has really permeated throughout society for some time, unabated. But that, therein lies the issue, really. It's a narrative that's remained somewhat unabated for so long and allowed its false narratives to become solidified, you know, along the way, because most people are ignorant, if you will, oblivious. But this shit, it said in the article that Police Scotland are actively doing more to recruit BAMEs, black people and browns. Why? Because this narrative has been constructed that because 4% of the police in Scotland are not BAME, that indicates some form of systemic racism. This is where we are now. This is where we're at. And I mean, it isn't limited to the police. We've seen this with the Parliament. We've seen this with teachers. There's an active drive in Scotland to diversify the teaching workforce, so much so that the words I just spoke there is a literal word-for-word quotation from a PDF, one of many, on the Scottish Government's own website. Diversifying the teaching workforce in Scotland. Now, the overall conclusion that's generated from these so-called anti-racists is that fucking, you guessed it, proportionate representation. 4% of the population, when this PDF was written and whatnot, is BAME. But yet, 4% of the teachers in Scotland ain't BAME. That's racism. Needs to change. It's just a constant attack on white people. And it seems to be such a taboo thing to say. You know, whether or not you're somebody that shows your face, waves placards about, writes Tumblr blogs, writes Twitter posts, records TikTok videos, or just sits anonymous on the sideline, whatever it is you do, I think there's a sort of general consensus that it's very taboo to even acknowledge the fact that there is an absolute attack on white people. It's constant. Which brings me back to what I was trying to get at earlier. Why is it such an issue that the police are white? Why do we need to diversify proceedings? Why? They don't see themselves. So fucking what? And any argument that you use to sort of push back against this will be used against you in the future. For example, Scotland's majority white, so it stands to reason that the police in Scotland will be majority white. Okay, what happens when it's not majority white? And then you complain, let's say you complain that you don't see yourself. Oh well, it stands to reason Scotland's majority black, so what do you expect? Every single thing that you can think of. When fundamentally it should just be stopped in its tracks. Why do they have an issue with the fact that the police in Scotland are predominantly white? You know? And it's issues like that, in and of themselves, that turned me into the sort of man I am today in terms of my beliefs. I went from being a guy who, by all sense of the word, never gave a fuck about politics. In many instances I still don't. Hard to believe, admittedly. I'm somebody who grew up thinking it didn't matter who you voted for, had no real interest in politics. Yes, my grandfather, who was a major influence in my life, played a role to a certain extent in terms of shaping my beliefs, in terms of giving compelling arguments. I don't mean that he just said things that I in turn reiterated because that's what it was cool to do. You know, he was very well versed in his history, very well versed in a lot of the political talking points of the day and the past, pertaining especially to Scottish independence, which was sort of gaining momentum in Scotland, 2012, 2013, 2014 era. A lot of his points, his views, I have in turn adopted myself. His views on the EU, immigration, etc. I in turn shared too. I didn't mimic nor copy. I, in time, adopted myself. And even my YouTube channel name though. So I had some of these sort of views, but my YouTube channel name, when I started my YouTube channel back in the day, like 2017 or something, Resisting the Lies. Like, that's not a channel name that's been created because I sit there and I resist the lies that Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond had to say back in the day, or Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater have to say today. No. That was because I was more into sort of conspiratorial topics. You know, your chemtrails, or ISIS, or false flags, or alleged false flags, and your